Marcus Johnson stood on the pristine sidewalk of Oak Hill Avenue, clutching his clipboard tightly against his debate team polo shirt. The afternoon sun beat down on the upscale neighborhood as he double-checked the signatures he collected for his environmental initiative. At 15, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from being raised by parents who taught him to hold his head high, regardless of the circumstances. The manicured lawns and elegant two-story homes of Oak Hill represented one of the city's most prestigious neighborhoods. Marcus had grown up here, though most new residents didn't know he was the mayor's son. That was exactly how his father wanted it. No special treatment, just an ordinary teenager learning to make his own way in the world. 23 signatures so far, Marcus muttered to himself, reviewing his progress. His environmental proposal to introduce citywide recycling programs in schools needed 50 signatures to be presented at the next city council meeting. He had promised his environmental club advisor that he would get them all by the end of the week. As he walked up the curved driveway of 1542 Oak Hill Avenue, Marcus noticed a woman peering through her front window. She quickly dropped the curtain when their eyes met. He'd seen that look before, the mixture of suspicion and unease that sometimes greeted him in unfamiliar spaces. His father had prepared him for such moments, teaching him to remain professional and focused on his goals. Marcus straightened his collar and pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed inside the house, but no one came to answer. He could still feel eyes watching him from behind the curtain. Taking a deep breath, he left one of his information pamphlets in the door's mail slot and moved on to the next house. At 1544 Oak Hill Avenue, an elderly man named Mr. Peterson welcomed him warmly. "Marcus, how's your father doing? Still keeping our city in shape?" the man asked, reaching for his reading glasses to review the petition. "He's doing well, Mr. Peterson." "Thank you for asking," Marcus replied politely, happy to see a familiar face. As Mr. Peterson signed the petition, Marcus noticed movement across the street. The woman from the previous house had stepped onto her porch, phone in hand, speaking in animated gestures while keeping her eyes fixed on him. Marcus felt his stomach tighten, recognizing the signs of what might come next. He'd heard enough stories from his father about similar situations. Still, he remained calm and thanked Mr. Peterson for his support. As he walked down Mr. Peterson's driveway, Marcus heard the distinctive sound of an approaching police siren in the distance. He glanced at his watch, 3:45 p.m. The afternoon had been going so well up until now. He thought about calling his father but decided to handle the situation himself first. After all, he had done nothing wrong. Two police cruisers turned onto Oak Hill Avenue, their lights flashing but sirens now silent. Marcus stood perfectly still, remembering his father's careful instructions. Keep your hands visible, stay calm, and be respectful but know your rights. The woman who had been watching him, middle-aged with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer casual wear, emerged fully from her house. She walked briskly toward the police cars as they parked, her phone still recording everything. "That's him," she called out, pointing at Marcus. "He's been wandering around the neighborhood, going to people's houses. He doesn't live here. I've never seen him before." Officer Reynolds and Officer Martinez stepped out of their vehicles, approaching Marcus with measured steps. Marcus recognized Officer Reynolds from community events but kept his face neutral. He slowly held up his clipboard, making sure his movements were clear and non-threatening. "Good afternoon, officers," Marcus said clearly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm collecting signatures for a school environmental project. I have my student ID and a letter from my teacher explaining the initiative." The woman interrupted before either officer could respond. "He could have fake documents. I've been watching him for the past hour. This is a private neighborhood, and we've had break-ins recently." Marcus felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. Probably his father checking in on him, as he did every afternoon. He knew this situation could escalate quickly, but he also knew that truth and dignity would prevail. His father had taught him that even in the most uncomfortable moments, how he carried himself mattered. Little did anyone on that street know that the next few minutes would transform a typical case of racial profiling into a powerful lesson for the entire community, starting with the woman who still stood there, phone raised, certain she was protecting her neighborhood from someone who had every right to be there. Karen Whitfield had lived in Oak Hill for exactly 3 months and 2 days. As the newest member of the Neighborhood Watch Group, she took her self-appointed responsibilities very seriously. Standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, she kept her phone steadily recording while the police officers approached the teenage boy she reported. "I pay too much in property taxes to have suspicious people wandering around," she muttered to herself, watching the scene unfold. Her social media live stream was already gathering attention, with comments flooding in from her followers who praised her vigilance. Officer Reynolds, a veteran of the force with 15 years of experience, immediately recognized something familiar about the teenager's features. The boy carried himself with the same dignified composure he'd seen in someone else, someone important, but he couldn't quite place it yet. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez called out to Karen, "could you please lower your phone and tell us exactly what suspicious activity you witnessed?" The younger officer was trying to follow protocol while managing what appeared to be an increasingly delicate situation. Karen stepped forward eagerly, her designer sneakers clicking on the sidewalk. "He's been going door to door for the past hour," she declared, as if announcing a major crime. "I saw him put something in my mailbox without permission. That's a federal offense, isn't it?" Marcus maintained his composure, though his heart raced beneath his calm exterior. He'd faced similar situations before, but never with police involvement. Slowly, he reached into his back pocket for his phone, making sure his movements were clearly visible to everyone. "Officers, I'd like to call my father now, if that's okay," Marcus said politely, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Also, Mrs. Whitfield, what I placed in your mail slot was an informational pamphlet about our school's environmental initiative. I'm happy to retrieve it if you prefer." Karen's eyes widened at the mention of her name. "How do you know who I am?" she demanded, taking a step back while zooming her phone camera closer to Marcus's face. "I'd seen you at the neighborhood association meetings," Marcus explained patiently. "My family has lived here for 3 generations. We sit in the back row usually, but I remember you introduced yourself rather enthusiastically at last month's meeting." Officer Reynolds' eyes suddenly lit up with recognition. Before he could speak, the sound of more cars approaching drew everyone's attention. Several neighbors had emerged from their homes, curious about the police presence in their usually quiet neighborhood. Mr. Peterson, who had signed Marcus's petition just minutes earlier, hurried down his driveway. "What on earth is going on here?" he called out, his elderly voice carrying across the lawns. "Why are you hassling this young man?" Karen turned her phone toward Mr. Peterson. "You know this person?" she asked incredulously. "Know him?" Mr. Peterson laughed, though there was no humor in his tone. "My dear lady, do you even know who you've called the police on? This is Marcus Johnson. He's been trick or treating at my house since he was in diapers." Officer Martinez looked increasingly uncomfortable, especially as more neighbors gathered, many of them greeting Marcus by name. Karen's confident posture began to falter, but she held her ground and her phone steady. "Well, if he lives here, why haven't I seen him before? And why is he going door to door? That's suspicious behavior, and as a member of the neighborhood watch, I have a responsibility to." Her words were cut short by the distinct sound of an approaching vehicle. The low rumble of a government-issued SUV turned onto Oak Hill Avenue, its tinted windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. Karen's phone was still broadcasting live as the black vehicle pulled up smoothly beside the police cruisers. The neighbors who had gathered fell silent. Officer Reynolds straightened his uniform unconsciously, while Officer Martinez took a small step back. Even Mr. Peterson's face broke into a knowing smile. Karen Whitfield, still recording everything, had no idea that her next few moments would become one of the most viewed social media clips in their city's history, for all the wrong reasons. The SUV's door opened, and a polished black shoe stepped onto the pavement, belonging to someone whose arrival would completely change the narrative she thought she was creating. Mayor David Johnson emerged from the black SUV with the practiced ease of a man who had handled delicate situations his entire political career. At 6 feet tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, he cut an imposing figure against the late afternoon sun. His presence immediately commanded attention from everyone gathered on Oak Hill Avenue. Karen's phone wavered slightly as she continued recording. The mayor's appearance had clearly caught her off guard, but she didn't yet make the connection between him and the teenager she'd reported. Her live-stream comments were exploding with recognition of the mayor, though she was too focused on the unfolding scene to notice. "Good afternoon, everyone," Mayor Johnson's deep voice carried across the lawn with authority and warmth. Officers Reynolds, Martinez, he nodded to each police officer in turn. I received an interesting call about a disturbance in my neighborhood. Would someone care to explain why there are police cars outside my family home? Karen stepped forward, still clutching her phone. Mayor Johnson, I'm so glad you're here. I'm Karen Whitfield, and I was just doing my duty as a neighborhood watch member. There's this young man going door to door, and in times like these, we can't be too careful about. The mayor raised his hand gently, stopping her mid-sentence. He turned to Marcus, his expression softening. Son, are you all right? Yes, Dad, Marcus replied calmly. I was just collecting signatures for the environmental project. 24 so far. The color drained from Karen's face as the word Dad echoed in her ears. Her phone, which had been broadcasting the entire incident, nearly slipped from her trembling fingers. The live stream comments exploded with reactions, many viewers realizing the situation had just taken an unexpected turn. Officer Reynolds cleared his throat. Mayor Johnson, we were responding to a call about suspicious activity. Had we known it was Marcus? And that's precisely the problem, isn't it? Mayor Johnson interrupted, his voice firm but measured. My son shouldn't need to be the mayor's child to feel safe collecting signatures in his own neighborhood. He shouldn't need me to show up for him to be treated with respect. The gathered neighbors murmured in agreement. Mr. Peterson nodded vigorously from his position near his driveway. Karen's confident posture had completely crumbled, and she finally lowered her phone, though the live stream continued running. Mrs. Whitfield, the mayor continued, turning to face her directly, I understand you're new to Oak Hill. Welcome to our community. I believe we met briefly at last month's neighborhood association meeting, though you might not have realized Marcus was my son. He was sitting right beside me. Karen's face flushed red as the memory surfaced. She had indeed given an enthusiastic speech about community safety at that very meeting, right in front of them both. I didn't know, she stammered, looking between Marcus and his father. The physical resemblance was now strikingly obvious, the same strong jaw, the same dignified bearing, the same intelligent eyes. Mayor Johnson picked up Marcus's clipboard, reviewing the signatures. An initiative to implement citywide school recycling programs, he read aloud. Officers, does this sound like suspicious activity to you? Both police officers shifted uncomfortably. Officer Martinez spoke first. No, sir. We apologize for any inconvenience. Perhaps we should have asked more questions before responding with such urgency. The mayor nodded, then addressed the gathered crowd. Neighbors, thank you for your concern and presence. I believe this situation offers us all an opportunity for growth and understanding. Marcus, why don't you tell everyone about your environmental initiative? As Marcus began explaining his project, Karen stood frozen, her phone still recording what had become a very different story than she'd intended to tell. Her live stream viewers were witnessing not the exposure of a suspicious person, but rather her own assumptions being publicly dismantled. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Oak Hill Avenue as the scene continued to unfold. What had started as a call to police was transforming into an impromptu community gathering, with Mayor Johnson skillfully turning a potential crisis into a teachable moment. However, this was far from over. The incident would soon spark conversations far beyond their prestigious neighborhood, reaching corners of their city that needed to hear this story most. The impromptu gathering on Oak Hill Avenue was interrupted by the arrival of local news fans. Karen's viral live stream had caught the attention of media outlets, and now 3 news crews were setting up their equipment on the perfectly manicured grass. Mayor Johnson watched them with a measured expression, years of political experience evident in his calm demeanor. Channel 5, Channel 8, and the City Tribune, he noted quietly to Marcus. Son, are you ready to handle this? We can go inside if you prefer. Marcus straightened his debate team polo and gripped his clipboard more firmly. I'm ready, Dad. Maybe we can use this to get even more signatures for the environmental initiative. Karen Whitfield stood off to the side, her phone finally lowered, watching as her afternoon of neighborhood vigilance transformed into breaking news. Her live stream was still running, but she seemed unsure whether to continue recording or slip away quietly. The shame on her face was evident as reporters began approaching her. Mrs. Whitfield called out Sarah Chen from Channel 5 News. can you explain why you felt it necessary to call the police on a teenage boy collecting petition signatures? Before Karen could respond, Mayor Johnson stepped forward. His years of handling delicate situations kicked in automatically. If we're going to have this discussion, he announced, let's have it properly. My family has lived in Oak Hill for 3 generations, and we've seen this community through many changes. Perhaps this is another opportunity for positive change. The reporters turned their attention to the mayor, cameras rolling. Officer Reynolds and Officer Martinez remained on scene, though they had retreated to their cruisers, clearly uncomfortable with the media presence. Mayor Johnson, another reporter called out, how do you feel about one of your constituents calling the police on your son? The mayor placed a supportive hand on Marcus's shoulder. This isn't just about my son, he replied firmly. This is about every young person who has ever been viewed as suspicious for simply existing in their own neighborhood. Marcus was fortunate. He had a father who could arrive in minutes and defuse the situation. Not everyone has that privilege. The gathered neighbors had grown in number, with more residents emerging from their homes to witness the unfolding scene. Mr. Peterson made his way through the crowd to stand beside Marcus. I've lived here for 40 years, Mr. Peterson spoke up, his voice carrying despite his age. I've watched Marcus grow up. He's been mowing my lawn since he was 12, refusing payment because he says neighbors help neighbors. That's the kind of young man he is. Marcus felt his face warm at Mr. Peterson's words, but he maintained his composure. A skill, he realized, that he had learned from watching his father handle difficult situations just like this one. Karen finally found her voice. I want to apologize, she said, stepping forward. The cameras swiveled to capture her words. I made assumptions. Terrible, unfair assumptions. I thought I was protecting my neighborhood, but instead, I was perpetuating the exact kind of behavior that damages communities. Mayor Johnson nodded acknowledgement of her apology, but didn't immediately respond. Instead, he turned to his son. Marcus, would you like to share what you're working on? Perhaps some good can come from this situation. Taking his father's cue, Marcus stepped forward. The confidence he developed through years of debate team training showed as he faced the cameras. I'm collecting signatures for a citywide school recycling initiative, he explained clearly. Our goal is to implement comprehensive recycling programs in every school across our city. We want to make our community not just safer, but cleaner and more sustainable for everyone. The reporters scribbled notes furiously, cameras continued rolling, and neighbors listened attentively. What had started as a potential tragedy was transforming into something else entirely, a moment of community reflection and possible change. Officer Martinez stepped forward, reaching for Marcus's clipboard. I'd like to sign your petition, he said quietly. And, I'm sorry about earlier. As the officer signed, others began stepping forward too. The line of people waiting to add their signatures grew, including several who had originally watched suspiciously from behind their curtains. Even Karen Whitfield joined the line, her phone now tucked away in her pocket, her face showing the first signs of understanding that real neighborhood safety came from connection, not suspicion. The late afternoon was far from over, and this story was about to spread far beyond Oak Hill Avenue, reaching into every corner of their city with its powerful message. By early evening, Oak Hill Avenue had become the epicenter of an unexpected community transformation. The mayor's office conference room, typically reserved for city planning meetings, was now filled with community leaders, activists, and concerned citizens who had seen Karen's viral livestream and the subsequent news coverage. Mayor David Johnson sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his suit jacket now draped over his chair, sleeves rolled up as he often did when tackling serious issues. Marcus sat beside him, his clipboard now containing over 100 signatures, far exceeding his original goal of 50. This incident, the mayor addressed the gathered group, while unfortunate, presents us with an opportunity. My son's experience today is not unique. It's happening across our city, but rarely does it get this level of attention. Karen Whitfield sat near the middle of the table, looking markedly different from the confident Neighborhood Watch member she'd been just hours ago. Her designer outfit seemed less important now as she listened intently to the discussions around her. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, head of the city's Cultural Diversity Board and no relation to Officer Reynolds, spoke up. Mayor Johnson, your handling of this situation was admirable, but we need to address the systemic issues that led to it. Mrs. Whitfield's actions didn't occur in a vacuum. Marcus, who had been quietly observing, raised his hand, a habit from his debate team training. May I suggest something? All eyes turned to the teenager who had unwittingly become the catalyst for this gathering. The floor is yours, son, his father nodded encouragingly. My environmental initiative was about bringing our community together for a common cause. Marcus began, his voice steady. What if we expanded it? What if we combined environmental awareness with community building? People are more likely to trust their neighbors when they work together on something meaningful. The room fell silent, considering his words. Karen Whitfield, who had been mostly quiet, suddenly straightened in her chair. I could help, she offered, her voice smaller than it had been during her live stream. I have experience in project management, and, she paused, looking directly at Marcus, I owe it to the community to do better. Chief Williams of the police department, who had arrived shortly after the news cruise, leaned forward. We're already implementing new training protocols for our officers, but community involvement would make them more effective. Officers Reynolds and Martinez's experience today highlighted some crucial gaps in our response procedures. The meeting continued as the sun set outside the conference room windows. City council members who had seen the viral video dropped in, adding their voices to the growing discussion. Local business owners called in, offering support for whatever initiatives would emerge from this incident. Marcus watched it all unfold, amazed at how his simple petition for school recycling programs had evolved into something much larger. His father had always told him that real change often came from unexpected moments, and now he was witnessing it firsthand. We need to name this initiative, suggested Council Member Jean. Something that captures both environmental responsibility and community unity. Green Bridge, Marcus said quietly, but his voice carried across the room. Because we're building bridges between neighbors while making our community greener. Mayor Johnson looked at his son with pride. Even in the midst of what must have been a traumatic experience, Marcus was thinking about solutions rather than dwelling on problems. Karen raised her hand tentatively. I could start by organizing a Green Bridge meeting in Oak Hill. My social media followers, the same ones who watched my terrible mistake today, might be interested in being part of the solution. The mayor nodded approvingly. Sometimes, Mrs. Whitfield, our worst moments can lead to our best contributions. As the meeting continued, Marcus's phone buzzed with messages from his debate team members who had seen the news. They were already organizing support at school, turning his original environmental initiative into a larger movement for community change. Outside the conference room, reporters waited for updates. The story had gone national, with major networks picking up on how a potential racial profiling incident had transformed into a catalyst for positive community action. But inside the room, the focus wasn't on the media attention. It was on the real work of turning an unfortunate incident into lasting change. The evening was far from over, and the real work was just beginning. But something significant had shifted in their city, all because of a teenager with a clipboard and a community forced to confront its unconscious biases. 1 week after the incident, the Oak Hill Community Center was packed beyond capacity. The inaugural Green Bridge Initiative meeting had drawn hundreds of residents from across the city, far exceeding anyone's expectations. Marcus Johnson stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd with a mixture of nervousness and determination. The past week had been a whirlwind of activity. His story had been featured on national news networks, and his school recycling petition had evolved into a citywide movement for environmental and social change. Even more surprising was seeing Karen Whitfield working tirelessly to help organize this event, transforming her viral infamy into something positive. Welcome, everyone, Marcus began, his debate team experience evident in his clear, confident voice. A week ago, I was just a student with a clipboard and an idea about school recycling. Today, we're all here because we believe in something bigger, the power of community to create positive change. In the front row, Mayor Johnson sat beside his wife Diana, both beaming with pride. Next to them were Officer Reynolds and Officer Martinez, who had requested to be designated as community liaison officers for the Green Bridge Initiative. The incident had prompted them to examine their own response protocols, leading to department-wide changes in community engagement. Karen Whitfield, dressed more casually than she had been during the incident, stood near the side of the stage, Her social media platform, once used to broadcast suspicion, was now dedicated to promoting community unity and environmental awareness. Her latest posts about Green Bridge had gone viral for all the right reasons. Last week taught me something important, Marcus continued. Environmental change and social change are connected. When we work together to clean our parks, organize recycling programs, or plant community gardens, we're not just helping the environment, we're building bridges between neighbors. The presentation screen behind him displayed the new Green Bridge logo, a simple design showing the Green Bridge connecting two communities, created by students from his high school art department. Below it were the initiative's first-year goals. Implementation of recycling programs in all city schools, monthly neighborhood cleanup events, community garden projects in every district, regular Know Your Neighbor gatherings, environmental education workshops. Mr. Peterson, who had been given a special seat of honor, nodded approvingly as Marcus outlined each point. The elderly neighbor had become something of a local celebrity after his defense of Marcus was captured on Karen's livestream. But this isn't just about Oak Hill, Marcus emphasized. We've received support from every neighborhood in our city. People want to be part of positive change. As if to prove his point, representatives from various community organizations stood up to pledge their support. Local businesses had donated supplies for cleanup events, schools across the city were implementing recycling programs ahead of schedule, and neighborhood associations were organizing their own Green Bridge chapters. Karen stepped forward when Marcus invited her to speak. The room fell silent. Many recognized her from the viral video, but her message today was very different. A week ago, I thought I was protecting my community by calling the police on a teenager with a clipboard, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. I was wrong, and that mistake could have had terrible consequences. But Marcus and Mayor Johnson showed me what real community protection looks like. It looks like neighbors working together, understanding each other, and building something positive. The audience applauded, many nodding in understanding. Karen's public acknowledgement of her mistake and her commitment to change had resonated with many who recognized their own biases. As the meeting continued, people broke into workshop groups to discuss specific projects. Marcus watched as former strangers engaged in animated conversations about community gardens and recycling programs. Officer Martinez was explaining police community outreach programs to interested residents, while Officer Reynolds discussed plans for youth engagement initiatives. The energy in the room was palpable. This was more than just an environmental project or a response to a viral incident. It was a community finding its way forward together. Mayor Johnson approached his son during a break, placing a proud hand on his shoulder. You've started something remarkable here, Marcus. We all did, Dad, Marcus replied, watching as Karen enthusiastically explained the Green Bridge website to a group of interested volunteers. Sometimes good things come from difficult moments. The meeting would continue well into the evening, but it was clear that this was just the beginning. What had started with a clipboard and a petition had grown into something that would change their city, one bridge at a time. 3 months after the incident, Oak Hill had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The Green Bridge initiative had spread far beyond its original scope, becoming a model for communities across the country. On a bright Saturday morning, Marcus Johnson stood in Oak Hill's Central Park, amazed at the crowd gathered for their monthly community event. What had once been perfectly manicured but rarely used parkland was now home to a thriving community garden. Rows of vegetables and flowers, planted and maintained by residents from all neighborhoods, created a colorful patchwork across the landscape. Even more impressive was the mix of people working together, residents from every part of the city, crossing invisible boundaries that had divided them for years. Karen Whitfield, wearing gardening gloves and a Green Bridge t-shirt, was teaching a group of children how to plant tomato seedlings. Her transformation from that infamous day had been remarkable. She'd become one of the initiative's most dedicated volunteers, using her organizational skills to coordinate events and her social media presence to spread awareness. Marcus, she called out, waving him over. These kids want to hear about how Green Bridge started. The children gathered around Marcus eagerly. Many of them knew the story. It had become almost legendary in their city, but they never tired of hearing it directly from him. Before he could begin, a familiar black SUV pulled up to the park. Mayor Johnson stepped out, but today he wasn't wearing his usual suit. Instead, He was dressed in jeans and a Green Bridge t-shirt, ready for the day's community work. Behind him, Officers Reynolds and Martinez arrived in their patrol car, also dressed casually for their off-duty volunteer work. "Look at this," the mayor said proudly, surveying the scene. 3 months ago, this park was empty most days. Now look at it. The changes were indeed striking. Solar-powered recycling stations dotted the pathways, each decorated with artwork from local school children. A new playground, built entirely by community volunteers, stood where empty space had been. The basketball court had been repainted with a mural promoting unity, designed collaboratively by artists from different neighborhoods. Mr. Peterson, who despite his age never missed a community event, sat at a newly installed bench overseeing the garden's herb section. He had become something of a mentor to many young volunteers, sharing his decades of gardening experience. "You know," he called out to Marcus, "when you first came to my door with that clipboard, I never imagined it would lead to all this." A news crew was setting up their equipment nearby, not to cover controversy this time, but to document the success of the Green Bridge initiative for a national feature story. Cities across the country had begun implementing similar programs, using Oak Hill's model as a template for combining environmental awareness with community building. The police department had also undergone significant changes. Officers Reynolds and Martinez now led training sessions on community engagement, using their experience from that day to teach other officers about bias awareness and proper response protocols. They had become regular faces at Green Bridge events, building genuine relationships with community members. "Marcus," Karen called again, "we just got confirmation from the city council. They've approved funding for Green Bridge programs in every district." The news brought cheers from the gathered volunteers. What had started as a simple school recycling petition had grown into a citywide movement with real funding and support. The initiative now included weekly environmental education programs in schools, monthly community cleanup and gardening events, regular neighborhood dialogue sessions, youth leadership programs, police community partnership projects. As Marcus walked through the park, he remembered that tense afternoon 3 months ago when he stood on Oak Hill Avenue, surrounded by police cars. The memory no longer carried pain. Instead, it reminded him of how communities could transform when people chose to learn from their mistakes and work together. A group of teenagers from his school's debate team arrived, carrying supplies for the day's activities. They had become regular volunteers, turning their public speaking skills toward advocating for environmental and social change. "You should be proud," Mayor Johnson said quietly to his son, watching the busy scene. "This is how real change happens, not through one big moment, but through all the small moments that follow, when people choose to keep showing up and doing the work." Marcus nodded, understanding now more than ever that sometimes the most challenging moments could lead to the most meaningful changes. As he joined the volunteers in their day's work, he knew that the story of Green Bridge was far from over. It was just beginning to bloom. 1 year after the incident that changed Oak Hill forever, Marcus Johnson stood on the stage of the City Convention Center, preparing to address the first annual Green Bridge National Conference. The huge hall was filled with representatives from over 50 cities across the country, all eager to learn from their community's transformation. Looking out at the audience, Marcus could hardly believe how far they'd come. Karen Whitfield sat in the front row, now serving as the National Green Bridge Program Director, her previous viral infamy completely transformed into a powerful story of change and redemption. Next to her, Officers Reynolds and Martinez, who had recently been promoted to lead the police department's new Community Relations Division, nodded encouragingly. 1 year ago, Marcus began, his voice steady and confident. "I was just a 15-year-old kid with a clipboard and a dream about school recycling programs. Today, I stand before you representing something much bigger, a movement that proves when communities face their challenges honestly, remarkable things can happen." The statistics displayed on the screen behind him told an impressive story. 100% of city schools now had recycling programs. Crime rates had dropped by 30% in participating neighborhoods. Community garden projects had produced over 50,000 pounds of fresh produce. Police community relations had improved significantly. Property values had increased while maintaining neighborhood diversity. Environmental awareness and community engagement were at all-time highs. Mayor Johnson watched from the side of the stage, no longer just a proud father, but also a proud leader of a city that had become a national model for community transformation. The incident that could have divided their community had instead united it in ways no one could have predicted. But the numbers don't tell the whole story, Marcus continued. The real story is in the small moments, like when Mrs. Chen from the east side shares her homegrown vegetables with Mr. Peterson, or when Officer Martinez coaches our youth basketball team, or when Karen teaches newcomers how to maintain our community gardens. Karen wiped a tear from her eye, remembering how far she'd come from that day when she'd called the police on Marcus. Her journey from that moment had become a powerful teaching tool in their community outreach programs. The presentation screen shifted to show images of green bridge projects across the city, community gardens bursting with produce, cleaned-up parks filled with playing children, neighborhood festivals where once separated communities now celebrated together, and police officers working alongside residents in various community projects. Mr. Peterson, now proudly serving as the program's elder advisor, stood up slowly to share his perspective. In all my years in Oak Hill, I've never seen anything bring people together like this. We're not just growing gardens, we're growing understanding. As Marcus concluded his speech, he made an announcement that brought the audience to their feet. Today, we're launching the Green Bridge Foundation, funded by national grants and corporate partnerships. This will allow us to help other communities implement similar programs, providing resources, training, and support to build their own bridges of understanding. The applause was thunderous. Representatives from other cities lined up to speak with Marcus and his team, eager to learn how they could replicate Oak Hill's success in their own communities. After the presentations, Marcus found a quiet moment with his father backstage. "Dad," he asked, "did you ever imagine my environmental petition would lead to all this?" Mayor Johnson smiled, straightening his son's tie. "Marcus, sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest beginnings. What matters is not how things start, but how people choose to respond when challenges arise." As they walked back into the main hall, they saw Karen showing her original viral video to a group of conference attendees, not with shame anymore, but as a powerful testimony to how communities could transform when they confronted their biases and chose to change. The day ended with a community dinner in the convention center's garden, where people from across the country shared meals and stories, building new bridges of their own. Marcus looked around at the diverse faces, all united in their commitment to positive change, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. What had started with a frightening confrontation on Oak Hill Avenue had blossomed into a nationwide movement for community transformation. As the sun set on the first Green Bridge National Conference, Marcus Johnson, now 16, knew that this was still just the beginning. The real work of building bridges, between communities, between people, and between different ways of seeing the world, would continue, one small step at a time.